107 years ago, in Nashville, Tennessee, something happened before breakfast that shook the entire country to its core and then, somehow, vanished from the history books almost entirely. Two trains, one track, over 100 people dead before most of the city had finished their morning coffee. This is the story of the worst train disaster in American history. A catastrophe born not from a storm, not from mechanical failure, not from anything that could be called truly unforeseeable, but from a chain of very human decisions made by very ordinary people on a very ordinary Tuesday. If you have never heard of it, you are not alone, and by the end of this film, you will understand exactly why that is. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with us, because the further into this story you go, the more difficult it becomes to look away. To understand what happened that morning, you first have to understand what America looked like in the summer of 1918, because the country that existed then was almost unrecognizable compared to the one we know today. There were no highways, no commercial airlines, no interstate system connecting city to city. If you needed to move people, supplies, soldiers, or mail across the United States, there was really only one reliable way to do it, and that was by train. The railroad was not just a form of transportation in that era. It was the circulatory system of the nation itself, the thing that kept everything moving, everything supplied, everything alive. And that system, in that particular moment in history, was being pushed harder than it had ever been pushed before. America had entered the First World War, and the demand placed on the railways was extraordinary. Munitions plants were being built and expanded across the country. Soldiers were being transported from training camps to ports on the Atlantic coast. Industrial workers were moving from one city to the next, chasing jobs that the war economy had suddenly opened up in places they had never been before. The federal government had actually taken direct control of the American railways the previous year, precisely because the pressure of wartime demand had become so intense that coordination across the entire network had become a national necessity. Every train on every line in every city was running full, running late, and running fast because the country needed it too. The margin for error that had always existed in peacetime, those small buffers built into schedules and operations that allowed crews to catch mistakes before they became disasters, had quietly disappeared in the urgency of the moment. Nashville, Tennessee, sat right at the center of this frenzy. It was a city that the railroad had helped build over decades, a regional hub where lines crossed and passengers transferred, where goods were loaded and unloaded, and where the rhythms of daily life were organized almost entirely around the schedule of the trains. Nashville's Union Station, which had opened at the turn of the century, was one of the most beautiful railway stations in the American South. Its great stone facade, its clock tower rising above the surrounding streets, its enormous vaulted interior where light came through high windows and fell across the marble floor and the crowded benches below. It was the kind of building that made you feel the weight and importance of what happened inside it, a place that communicated through its architecture alone that the movement of people and things through this city mattered. Every morning, dozens of trains moved in and out of that station, carrying with them thousands of lives heading somewhere, and the city had grown to organize itself around those comings and goings in the way that cities always grow around their most vital arteries. The railway that operated the two trains at the center of this story was called the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway, known to everyone who worked on it simply as the NC and STL. It was a well-established line that ran through the heart of Tennessee and connected Nashville to Memphis in the west and to Chattanooga in the east. It was not a small or poorly managed railway by the standards of the time. It had a solid reputation, experienced crews, and decades of operating history. It was, by any reasonable measure, a professional organization running a professional service in the middle of a very demanding moment in American history. But there was one particular stretch of track on the western route out of Nashville that had always made experienced railroaders uneasy. About 5 miles outside the city, beyond the railway's large workshop complex, the double tracks that allowed trains to pass each other safely narrowed down to a single line. That single track section ran for about 10 miles through the quiet western edge of the city, past open farmland and cornfields, and through a section the railroaders called Dutchman's Curve. It was a long, sweeping bend in the track where the visibility ahead was almost zero. The curve itself was not particularly sharp, but the combination of its arc, the slight grade of the land, and the bridge that crossed above it at White Bridge Road meant that from inside a locomotive cab approaching that bend, you could not see what was coming toward you until it was almost directly in front of you. Everyone who had ever driven a train on that line knew it. The curve had a reputation. Remarkably, it was not even the first accident that had happened there. Earlier that same year, in February, a rear-end collision involving 3 trains had occurred at the very same location, and people had died then too. The curve was already marked in the memory of the local railway community as a dangerous place, a place where the ordinary rules of visibility did not apply and where the consequences of miscommunication arrived faster than anyone could react to them. It was the kind of place where if something went wrong, there would be very little time to respond. The rule that governed that single-track section was straightforward. When 2 trains needed to use it at the same time, the one traveling inbound toward Nashville had the right of way. The outbound train was required to wait at the double-track section near the workshop complex at a point called Shops Junction, and only proceed onto the single track once the crew had visually confirmed that the incoming train had already passed. Not assumed, not guessed, confirmed. That distinction between assuming and confirming would turn out to be everything. On that particular morning, the train heading into Nashville from Memphis was carrying a very specific group of passengers that tells you a great deal about the America of that moment. Alongside the usual mix of travelers, the train was packed with black workers from Arkansas, from Memphis, from towns scattered across the Deep South, men who had heard about a massive new munitions plant being built just outside Nashville in a place called Old Hickory. The plant was run by DuPont, one of the most powerful industrial companies in the country, and it was producing gunpowder for the American war effort on a truly enormous scale. The plant at Old Hickory was one of the largest of its kind anywhere in the world, and it needed thousands of workers to run it. For the men boarding that train in Memphis and along the route westward, the journey to Nashville represented something they had rarely been offered before. These were men living under the restrictions of Jim Crow, in a South where their economic options were tightly controlled and their safety was never guaranteed. The war had created something rare, which was genuine demand for their labor, and the wages being offered at the powder plant were better than almost anything available to them back home. Many of them had never traveled this far from home before. Some were making their first long train journey. For the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt wider than the one behind. But there was a detail about how they were traveling that would become one of the most painful parts of this story. Under the segregation laws that governed public transportation across the South, black passengers were required to ride in separate coaches from white passengers. These were the Jim Crow cars, placed in specific positions in the train and separated from the rest of the carriages by law and by custom. They were not equivalent in comfort to the cars assigned to white passengers, and they were not equivalent in safety either. On the inbound train that morning, the coaches carrying the black workers were positioned at the front of the passenger section, directly behind the locomotive in the section of the train that would take the worst of any impact in a head-on collision. The physics of this placement were not mysterious or complicated. Anyone who understood how trains behave in a crash would have understood immediately what it meant to put the most vulnerable passengers in those front cars. This was not an accident of placement. It was the direct result of a legal system that had decided where different people were allowed to sit, and that decision would have consequences before the morning was over. Back in Nashville, preparing to depart in the other direction, was the outbound train heading to Memphis. Its crew that morning included a man named David Kennedy, the engineer who would sit in the cab of the locomotive and drive the train west. Kennedy was a veteran of the railway, someone who had made this run many times and knew the route well. With him was the conductor, a man called James Eubank, known around the line by the nickname Shorty, a small, energetic figure who ran a tight train. Both men had received their orders before departure, the standard paperwork that told them what to expect on the route ahead. Those orders included a very specific piece of information. The inbound train for Memphis was running late that morning, which meant that when Train 4 reached Shops Junction, the crew needed to hold their position and wait for the inbound train to pass before proceeding onto the single track. They knew this. Kennedy had even commented on it before departure, noting that the inbound train was running behind schedule. Both men were aware of what was required of them. The station was busy that morning, as it always was during the war years. Groups of military recruits were trying to board, looking for space on a train that was already packed beyond comfortable capacity. A well-known Nashville businessman named Willis Ferris arrived at the platform. and a young bookkeeper who recognized him offered his own seat so the older man could travel in more comfort, a small act of courtesy in the middle of an ordinary busy morning. Regular passengers were finding their places, stowing their bags, settling in for the journey. The bustle and noise of a wartime morning in a busy station, everyone with somewhere to be, everyone moving with purpose. And then the whistle sounded, the great locomotive sent its steam into the morning air, and the train pulled out of Union Station and headed west. What happened over the next 13 minutes was not a single catastrophic error. It was a sequence of smaller ones, each one building on the last, each one closing off another avenue of escape from what was coming. Understanding that sequence is what makes this story so deeply unsettling, because at multiple moments, the disaster could have been stopped. And each time it wasn't. As Train 4 moved west through the double-track section outside Nashville, Conductor Eubank had one job that mattered above everything else that morning. He needed to visually confirm that the inbound train from Memphis had passed them on the opposite track before reaching Shops Junction. If it had not passed, Train 4 had to stop and wait. That was the rule. That was the only thing standing between a normal Tuesday and a catastrophe. But Eubank was behind on his ticketing, having been reprimanded recently for not collecting passenger fares quickly enough, and that morning he was moving through the carriages at pace, chasing his own schedule. Rather than watching for the inbound train himself, he handed that responsibility to the porter and the flagman at the rear of the train. This was not an unusual practice. Eubank had done it before, and so had the conductor who alternated with him on the same route. It was one of those habits that forms over time in any working environment, a shortcut that feels acceptable because nothing has ever gone wrong when you've done it. But then, as the train was moving through the double-track section, a switch engine pulling a string of empty passenger cars passed on the adjacent track. The rattle and roll of it, the sound of cars moving past, was close enough to the sound of the inbound train that Eubank, distracted and moving fast, heard it and registered it as the confirmation he needed. He did not check. He did not look. He heard something pass, and he moved on. The porter and flagman either made the same mistake or simply did not recognize what they were looking at. Either way, no one at the rear of the train raised an alarm. The crew of Train 4 believed they had seen the inbound train go past. They had seen nothing of the sort. And then Train 4 reached Shops Junction, the one checkpoint that stood between a manageable situation and an irreversible one. Tower operator J.S. Johnson was alone in his booth, and as Train 4 came into view, he did what he had done many times before. He showed a clear signal, indicating that the line ahead was safe to proceed. The crew of Train 4 saw it and rolled through without hesitation. But then Johnson did what he was supposed to do after clearing a train, which was to record its passage in his log. And when he looked at the log, he saw something that stopped him cold. There was no entry showing that the inbound train had passed. Not a gap, not a delay, simply nothing. The inbound train had not been logged through Shops Junction, which could only mean one thing. It had not been through. It was still out there, somewhere on the line ahead, heading directly toward Train 4 on the same single-track section. Johnson grabbed the telegraph and sent an urgent message to the dispatcher. The reply came back almost immediately. "Stop him. Can you stop him?" Johnson did the only thing he could from where he was standing, which was to sound the emergency whistle. He blew it hard and repeatedly. But Train 4 was already past the junction, already moving west at speed, and the emergency whistle was positioned to be heard at the rear of the train. There was no one at the rear to hear it. No one passed the message forward. The train kept moving. Inside the cab of the locomotive, David Kennedy was driving his train west, unaware that anything had gone wrong. The landscape outside was open and quiet, the kind of flat Tennessee farmland that give you nothing to look at and nothing to worry about, and the track curved gently ahead through the still morning air. And then the track bent into Dutchman's curve, and the white bridge passed overhead, and the cornfields opened out on either side. And somewhere in the fraction of a second that followed, Kennedy saw what was coming toward him. He hit the emergency brake. He had perhaps a heartbeat to react. It was not enough. The sound of the collision was heard 2 miles away. People living near the track described it as something beyond any noise they had experienced before, a thunderous, tearing, grinding explosion that shook the ground and rattled windows and sent birds scattering from the trees across the whole surrounding area. One man who was a child living near the track at the time, interviewed decades later when he was elderly, said that what he remembered most was not the crash itself, but the sounds that came after it. He said they were the most dreadful sounds he had ever heard in his life. The two locomotives, each weighing roughly 80 tons and moving at full speed, met head-on the curve. Both engines reared upward from the track and fell sideways, reduced in an instant to what a newspaper at the time described as unrecognizable masses of twisted iron and steel. The front cars of both trains absorbed the impact and were destroyed almost immediately. The passenger coaches of Train 4 were all made of wood, and wood does not absorb the force of two colliding locomotives. Those coaches shattered, their frames snapping apart, their walls folding inward, the entire front section of the train collapsing in the space of a breath. The express car of the inbound train was driven directly through the first coaches of Train 4 by the force of the collision, telescoping the cars into each other and piling wreckage high into the air above the cornfield. Fires broke out in the wreckage almost immediately. The splintered wood caught quickly in the dry summer air, and within minutes multiple fires were burning across different sections of the crash site. Survivors who were able to move were pulling themselves out of the wreckage or being dragged out by the first rescuers to arrive. Many of those who were closest to the point of impact had no chance at all. The engineer of the inbound train, the man who had been making his very last journey before retirement, was killed instantly. David Kennedy, the engineer of Train 4, did not survive either. Nor did George Hall, the porter of Train 4, a man well known and well liked across Nashville, who had been trying to make his way forward through the train when the collision happened. Among the passengers on the inbound train, an 18-year-old named George Scott had spent much of the overnight journey unable to sleep, unsettled by a feeling he could not explain or shake. It had kept him awake through the darkness, this nameless unease that would not leave him alone. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, he had left his assigned seat and walked to a passenger car further back in the train, pulled down the window shade, and simply waited. He did not know why he did it. He could not account for it afterward. He survived. The car he had been sitting in before was destroyed. The black workers from Arkansas and Memphis who had been riding in the Jim Crow cars at the front of the inbound train were among the hardest hit. The law had put them in the most dangerous position on the train, and the crash had done exactly what anyone who understood physics would have predicted. A voice heard at the scene afterward, one of the volunteers who had come to help and who was discovering, body by body, that the dead were overwhelmingly from among those front carriages, spoke out in grief and fury. The words were recorded and passed down. Must we always be pinned up in the most dangerous place on the train, where it is impossible to save ourselves in cases like this? Take heed. Segregation must end. By mid-morning, the scene at Dutchman's Curve was unlike anything Nashville had ever witnessed. Estimates placed the crowd that gathered at somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people. They came from everywhere, farmers abandoning their fields, residents from the surrounding streets, the crew of a nearby train waiting at Harding Station, workers from a local orphanage, people who had heard the sound from miles away and simply started walking toward it. They came to help, to search for relatives, to pull survivors from the wreckage, to carry the injured toward the makeshift medical stations that were being set up nearby. Some of them worked for hours in the heat of the July sun, moving through wreckage that was still smoldering, lifting debris with whatever tools they had brought. The city's hospitals were overwhelmed within hours. Physicians arrived and volunteered their services without being asked. Nurses stayed through the heat of the day, attending to the wounded. A local newspaper, the Nashville Globe, one of the city's African-American publications, noted something that struck its editors as remarkable enough to put on the front page. In the chaos of the rescue effort, it wrote, the color line was forgotten, and white volunteers rushed to the aid of the black survivors without hesitation or distinction. It was a moment of shared humanity that the paper felt compelled to document precisely because it stood out against the ordinary rules of how life in that city normally worked. And while all of this was happening, while families were still searching for their missing and the fires were still being put out, the railway company had already dispatched its repair crews to the site. By sundown, the track at Dutchman's Curve had been cleared, repaired, and reopened. Trains were moving through the same bend again before the last of the bodies had been identified. Business resumed. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Interstate Commerce Commission, the federal body responsible for railway safety at the time. It was thorough, it was detailed, and its conclusions were blunt in a way that government reports rarely allow themselves to be. The commission found that the accident had been caused by a combination of human error and systemic failure, and it was unwilling to pin everything on a single individual, even though the pressure to do exactly that was enormous. Engineer David Kennedy was publicly blamed. The narrative that formed in the immediate aftermath of the crash was simple and satisfying in the way that simple narratives always are. Kennedy had driven his train onto the single track without confirming that the inbound train had passed. Kennedy had failed in his duty. Kennedy was responsible. He had died in the crash, which meant he could not defend himself, and in death he was denied even the basic dignity of a proper burial. He was a Catholic man and was refused a Catholic funeral service. He was put in the ground without ceremony, without a crowd, without the rites his faith called for. But the commission's report told a more complicated story. Yes, Kennedy and conductor Eubank had failed to confirm the passage of the inbound train before entering the single track, as the rules required. Yes, the tower operator had shown a clear signal without verifying that the inbound train had actually passed. All of those failures were real and documented. But the commission went further than simply listing the human errors and called out the railway company itself for creating conditions in which those errors were not just possible, but almost predictable. The habit of delegating the confirmation responsibility from the conductor to junior crew members was not something that Kennedy and Eubank had invented. It was a widespread practice on that line, used regularly by multiple crews, never corrected by management, never addressed in training. The railway company knew how its crews were operating and had chosen not to intervene. Beyond that, the commission pointed to two structural failures that went far beyond any individual decision made that morning. The first was the wooden coaches. The technology and the materials for steel construction were available. Other railway companies had already made the transition. The commission stated plainly that had steel cars been used throughout the train, the death toll would undoubtedly have been very much less. The railway had chosen not to upgrade because upgrading cost money, and that choice had consequences measured in human lives. The second structural failure was the absence of an automatic block signal system on the single-track section. This was a technology that existed, that was in use on other lines, and that would have prevented a train from entering an occupied section of track regardless of what any human operator did or failed to do. The commission found that the railway had all the necessary infrastructure already in place to install such a system, and had simply not done so. Their conclusion on this point was unusually direct. A properly operated manual block system on that line, they wrote, would have prevented this accident beyond any question of doubt. A historian named Betsy Thorpe spent years researching this disaster and wrote a book about it. In the course of that work, she became increasingly convinced that David Kennedy had been made to carry a burden that was not entirely his to bear. She could not prove it definitively. The evidence was incomplete, the record was old, and the man himself was not there to speak. But the weight of what she found led her, in the end, to visit Kennedy's grave. She went to apologize to him. She felt she had let him down. The immediate consequence of the disaster was a wave of pressure on the American railway industry to address the safety failures the crash had so brutally exposed. New requirements came into force around crew accountability and the management of single-track sections. The push to replace wooden passenger coaches with steel construction accelerated sharply. And over the years that followed, the wooden car largely disappeared from American passenger railways. Automatic signaling systems became standard rather than optional on high-risk sections of track. The suffering of the people who died at Dutchman's Curve was not entirely in vain in that sense. Some of what broke that morning was fixed afterward. But there is another part of what remained that is harder to talk about. The black workers who made up the majority of the dead were, in the official record, largely unnamed. Their families in Arkansas and Memphis and across the South received no formal notification, no organized response from the railway company. They were left to piece together what had happened from newspaper reports and word of mouth, learning slowly and incompletely that the son or the brother or the husband who had set out full of hope toward a new job was not coming home. The railway company paid out claims in the lawsuits that followed, but the amount of attention given to identifying and honoring the black victims was not equivalent to what was given to the white passengers who had died alongside them. And then, with a speed that is perhaps the most quietly devastating part of this entire story, the disaster faded. The country moved on. The war ended a few months later. The years kept coming, the Depression, another world war, Decades of change and turbulence and history layering itself over what had happened on that Tuesday morning in the cornfield. Most Nashville residents, for most of the 20th century, had never heard of Dutchman's curve, had never been told it existed, had never thought to ask. A wreck that killed more people than any train accident before or since in American history had simply been absorbed into silence. It was not until 90 years after the crash that a historical marker was finally placed at the site, the result of a community effort led largely by Betsy Thorpe, who raised the funds, gathered the support, and pushed for the recognition that had been missing for nearly a century. The marker stands near White Bridge Road, modest in size, easy to walk past without noticing. Most people who drive along that road every day do not know it is there. And then, on the 100th anniversary, the city of Nashville held a ceremony at the White Bridge, the old bridge that crosses the track above the site of the wreck. The mayor was there. Historians were there. Descendants of the victims were there. People who had grown up hearing fragments of this story from grandparents who had lost someone, people who had carried unanswered questions about their families for decades. And together they read aloud the names of the 101 people who had died on that spot. It took a long time. There were a lot of names. When they finished reading the names, a train passed underneath the bridge. A modern freight train, rolling through the same bend where those two locomotives had met more than a century before, on the same track that has carried traffic without interruption ever since. Someone in the crowd dropped flowers from the bridge as the train went by, and the petals fell between the rails and disappeared into the rush of air behind the locomotive. The track at Dutchman's Curve is still active. Freight trains pass through it every day, through the same curve where everything fell apart that Tuesday morning, past the cornfields that are gone now, replaced by a quiet suburban neighborhood where people go about their lives a few hundred meters from a spot that most of them know nothing about. There is no monument you can see from the road. There is no marker large enough to stop traffic. There is only the curve and the sound of trains passing through it, and the knowledge, if you have it, of what that ground once held. That is perhaps the most important reason to tell this story. Not because it is exceptional, but because it is not. Because it is a story about how ordinary mornings can end in catastrophe when the small choices that hold everything together are made carelessly, and how the people who bear the cost of those choices are so often the ones who had the least power to change them. 101 people left home that morning and did not come back. They were workers, veterans, porters, engineers, young men on their very first journey away from everything they had ever known. They deserve to be remembered by name, not just by number, and the story of how they died deserves to be told fully and honestly, with all its complexity and all its discomfort intact. That is what we have tried to do here. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would want to know it. History that is allowed to disappear is history that can never warn us, never protect us, never teach us to do better. Thank you for watching until the end.